We did that one. Did that one, that one, that one, that one. Yeah.
Would that say don't create a botanical?
Garden. Master gardeners are known for having a plant collection instead of a true landscape. So you want to just think what plants are going to work and keep it simple. And then if you have plants you really want, you may want to make some special beds for those, if it doesn't fit in the landscape. But, the idea is to have some positive repetition within the landscape, but what we don't want to do is monoculture, like some people plant blue spruce all the way around their property to have a visual break. And then if you get the needlecast disease going through that tree canopy, before you know it, you don't
Too many trees.
don't have any trees. And then the worst thing is when the trees grow together, which is what they want, if one dies and you cut it down and the other two are still healthy, they have huge holes that will never fill in because they're evergreens. So then you still have two ugly trees. And then we cut down those trees, the ones beside them will be ugly. So I don't know what you do, but I guess you would plant another tree. Hopefully people are space them so that doesn't happen and start eliminating trees when it starts to happen. And you can stagger them. If you have enough property, if that's what you're trying to do. But, and the main thing is to plant some diversity. So don't just do one species. Don't have a blue spruce beside a blue spruce.
Right.
Actually, don't plant blue spruces.
Are they not indigenous to this area, or?
We have a disease issues with them. So the state of Michigan's already extension recommends not planting them. And I've got a picture in this presentation at the end of a whole property that by the time they called me, it was too late. I mean, once you get
The library is now closed.
once you get the disease on the tree, fungicides don't kill the fungus. So it takes like 3 years of spraying multiple times within a year to get it under control if you don't catch it early.
But the parts that have been affected are already done?
Yeah.
Do they come back at all?
No, not on evergreens. Once the tip is done, it's done. Now, if you catch it, if it's infected, you can catch it, and the new tips will come out next spring. So you spray that new growth, and then but the needles that dropped from the previous year as well spread the disease, and there'll be needles on the trees that spread it. So you got to spray it the second year to protect the second years of new growth. Then hopefully by the third year, enough of the older needles are infected are no longer actively spreading the fungus. So it takes a good 3 years of spraying the tree on a regular basis to prevent the spread to get it back to where it's not going to be. And the educator in Elkhart County would just say, I'm crazy for even sharing that. He would just say it's done. Because there's other problems with blue spruces. They're beautiful trees. If you have one blue spruce and no one in the neighborhood has a blue spruce, you're okay.
Is that a national problem?
Yeah, I mean, out of its zone, it's really made for a higher elevation. So
Colorado.
white pine is our best pine tree, but there's other spruces that are better than a blue spruce. Even a Norway spruce doesn't have a needlecast disease. And then like Douglas fir has the needlecast disease, and my arborist coworker says, we got the weaker cultivar. There's some cultivars of Douglas fir that are more hardy to its needlecast disease. But I've seen Douglas fir solid plantings that are infected, and so diversity is the best thing.
Right.
If you want to, don't just pick one cultivar of a tree because we were worried about our walnut trees with 1,000 canker disease, but it's not as aggressive when you have moisture. So it really hurts black walnut trees out west because they're dry. And it will infect our walnuts here, but it doesn't impact them like it does out there because we tend to have moisture. Rainfall is actually going up these days.
Always a bumper crop for walnuts.
Yeah. So, but we're kind of scared because that's your number one, Will Irwin on his property We were going through his managed woods and he just was pointing out $5,000 log, $5,000 log, $5,000 log all throughout the woodlands of black walnuts.
Mhm.
You know, because he managed them to have no limbs on the lower logs, so you get maximum veneer quality. And, you know, so those trees are in demand, so
Right.
they're worried about losing that industry. That's what we are. We're a hardwood industry. Our climate is for trees.
Mhm.
You know, so we're not like the southeastern United States grows pine trees, and they just harvest them like you harvest corn when they get to harvest a block, and then they replant it, and they'll harvest another block, and that goes to making paper and different, well, lumber.
Mhm.
I mean, it's pine. That's our main lumber we buy, and we're building houses now.
Right.
So it's just interesting. Well, 6:04. We'll get started tonight. So I'll finish off the discussion of last week, getting into some problems with the trees and plants and landscapes. And then we'll probably cover some action steps we can do yet this year to help make things better for next year. We covered, so we want to principles of landscaping. We just make sure we get the right plant for the right spot. That's critical. You know, that's what the mistake most people do. They get their dogwood and they put it out by the road in direct sun. Well, that's not what that tree was made to be. It's an understory tree, so it prefers filtered light versus direct sun all day. So if you place the plant in its wrong spot, it's going to have more issues than if you plant it in the right spot. So we just need to make sure that we know what our plants need before we plant them and put them where they need. I did this, I did that one, talked about that one, talked about that. Oh, okay, now we're gonna get, you know, so again, plan the right space, provide adequate space for the mature size of the tree. Just think about aggressive plants, you know, I have my archangel, which is a very aggressive vine. And it's good and it's attractive, but I'll talk more about it next week. You know, the issues you get into planting some aggressive plants. And just know the requirements before you purchase them. We were just talking about that. I mean, blue spruce is a good example. If we plant just the same tree, you know, on our property, if they have a weakness, then that weakness could take them all out. Just think if you had a lot of ash trees, either you spend a lot of money to treat them or you planted new trees. Emerald ash borer took them out. Where if you had plant diversity of an ash tree, a maple tree, you know, an oak tree, by a larger property, then that emerald ash borer would impact one tree, and you could afford to treat one tree because that would have been $200 a year. But to treat 5 trees, that's, I mean, you could afford that too if that was your goal. But that'd be $1,000 per year that you have to spend for 12 years to keep them alive. Mm-hmm. So, what's my point here? That that tree was not planted in the right spot, so that it's resulting in some major issues with the lower trunk and the root development. You know, so when we plant large trees right by the sidewalks and environments like that, it can actually end up being an issue. I mean, I walked through Plymouth just taking pictures one time of problem trees. I didn't have to walk too many blocks. We have all these trees planted in these locations that aren't adequate for the root of the plant to grow and thrive. We don't have, you know, so that puts trees as they get bigger under some stress. So sizing trees and giving it enough space to keep the crown away from obstructions. You know, so that's the sidewalk being here is part of it. And there could be other issues. This tree looks like the bark's not the best, but then a lot of our trees, as they age, the bark naturally just becomes loose. So that's not always an indication that there's an issue with the tree. I know the cultivar. Okay, so again, I'm thinking, if this is this an alley or roving?
That's an alley.
So it's better than I thought. It was planting evergreens by roads, and we use salts on the roads to break up the ice. The salts will get on the sides and cause damage of evergreens on the side that gets salted. In some winters, if the weather's severe, it depends on how much salt is being used. And then if it's a big winter and we have a lot of snow, there's going to be snow pushed up against the side of these trees. So planting a plant that's going to get much larger than it currently is in a space it's going to fill in when you're going to have that road tractor, it's not the best location for those. So that'd be my concern, planting those there. I would pick something that was deciduous, possibly that I can prune up a little bit. But the whole problem is that's not very wide, right? So it may be a better place for perennial flowers and plants that die back each winter versus plants that are going to take up space and be a permanent growth there, because that's probably not the best habitat for those. Just think about anything that has a fruit. We're talking about walnuts. I had a walnut tree once, covered my yard. You couldn't mow, you had to pick them up. They're not really worth that much if you take them off and sell them. And I had this one person that called me once, his wife, and asked me what her husband could do to get them black, because he is dehauling walnuts barehanded. So both of his hands were completely black. And by the time she went through the list of what he tried, I said, he just needs to give it time to wear off. You put stuff on his hands you shouldn't put on your hands. Trying to get it off. Fruit, it's going to rot unless you pick it up. I have pear trees, apple trees, and I pick up my fruit and just feed it to my sheep, the excess that I have. So I have an outlet for my fruit. But you just want to think about that, because even gumwort woods and different trees will have a fruiting structure that falls that could be a nuisance. So either embrace that and be glad to have it, or just think it through before you select a plant that may do that. And then we want to just think about insect pests. So we have some insects that will attack our plants, do some leaf feeding. It's not a major issue because they're not going to hurt the tree. Fall webworms, if you have a tree cultivar that they are attracted to, you want to prune them out early. It's the only thing you can do to really manage them because they're protected by this web. So we get all these insects from Asia that bother us, like the stink bug, marmorated stink bug, what killed our ash trees. That insect came from Asia. We gave them fall webworms. So if it's any solace, they're dealing with fall webworms in Asia now. We gave them that, so on their trees that it would attract to, rose-related plants, walnuts. It's a pest, and I had a picture. It just wasn't a very good image, but there's a tree on Michigan Street that no one's treating because it's just part of the woodlands, but it's totally defoliated by fall webworms. So if you let them get out of control, they would get on my walnut tree in southern Indiana, and I couldn't reach them to do anything because the tree is too tall. So luckily, they just didn't thrive that well to defoliate that tree. It was a big tree, but it was a fairly big tree I saw defoliated on Michigan. So you want to just think about what pests may be present from insects that could be a nuisance to you if you select a tree. Because then with some pests, just got to be educated, because instead of the fall webworm, the bagworm, which looks like a little cone on evergreens and people don't think anything about them. Each one of those will have up to 300 eggs. So you can have 15 of those on your tree 1 year. And then let's just say it's a lousy winter and only 100 eggs survive. 15 times 100 is 1,500 bagworms crawling around defoliating your tree the next year. So knowing what pests you have in the case of bagworms by removing those, or just checking them in the spring to see if the eggs made it through the winter, we don't have as big of an issue typically as southern Indiana because our winters used to kill them. It's marginal now. But in southern Indiana, where I worked around there, I go by people's houses thinking, well, I should go knock on the door and tell them it's not cones on their tree, it's something eating them and it's defoliating them with evergreens. When they kill the tips and that branch is dead. And then you have a hole forever in that tree, making it ugly in your landscape. I talked about this, right, already? I mean, look at these rocks around the base of this tree. Everyone thinks it's cool to put that up there. There's a lot of issues with this tree. It was not pruned right when it was a young tree because we have multiple branches coming out of one trunk. Ideally, you have a central leader going up and not branching until it gets higher up into the tree. Canopy. So this tree wasn't managed when it was a young tree, and look in your yard. I'm sure you have a tree just like this. I mean, a lot of these trees happen just because the tree, we plant them and they go, and no one thinks to do pruning as they're growing when they're smaller trees to make them a central leader tree. Then you look at the base of this tree and it's covered in soil. So I don't see a root flare. Do you see a root flare at the base of that tree? So my concern is that, not only is there no root flare, but we created this rocky surface around it. And then when you bury trunks, roots will come out of that trunk. You'll create what we call adventitious roots that grow out of that trunk. And it's going to hit this rock and then it'll grow back towards the tree because it can't grow through rock. And eventually you'll get roots growing beside the trunk of the tree. And then when they get fairly large, that will be a girdling root. So we'll have other pictures actually showing a girdling root later on. So, that's just how this tree's been managed, created instead of a low maintenance landscape, a high end maintenance landscape. And it can be an issue. The landscape up by the house isn't that bad. So some of those need pruning, but it's the tree that's the reason why that picture was taken. And then species of trees. Slippery elms are just a junky tree. So if you get a tree that tends to drop branches and limbs come out of it, see these limbs have fallen off of it. And that's just the nature of this tree. It's not a hardwood tree. And I've got one I should cut down too because branches come out of it. Actually, I took a picture of mine, but then I saw this one, and this is actually a better picture because it's in a town environment where these branches falling can hit stuff that can cause damage for sure. Now, I wasn't taking a picture of a bison. Vines, we got to be managing vines on our landscapes because here this English ivy looks nice, but people let that grow up the side of their house. And when it grows up to the side of the house, it will get on wood. It can damage the wood. I had it growing the side of my house in southern Indiana. It actually would go into my roof area, find ways to get in there. So it was a constant battle of pruning it. So then if it's a lot of work to maintain it, to keep it from being a problem, then it may be best just to remove it. It depends on what you want. In this case, this vine has gone up the side, covering this chimney. It looks cool, but it could be doing some damage to the house. And then the biggest concern is vines growing on our trees, especially our specimen trees. Anything that's vining on it, it could be wild grapes growing up the side of it. It could be Virginia creeper. Some people even well, in the English ivy, but the trouble is, and then Oriental bittersweet is a invasive weed that can grow up the side of it. It can girdle the wood and just be like kudzu in the south. You know, it can damage the tree by growing around something, and as it grows, it girdles that branch. So it's not good to have binding plants growing up on stuff. So low maintenance is we keep our binding plants to a minimum and keep them in place so that they don't become an issue. It is a neat picture. Isn't it?
Really?
I was taking the picture of the bison. The vines were just in the background. I decided to pull it out with this. Oh, why is that shrub there? Does anyone have a reason for that shrub to be there?
On the property.
Hey, that's amazing.
It has a tree of heaven tree, a bad tree growing out of it, so that needs to be removed and maintained. And the shrub just needs to be pruned to be. It's not impacting the sidewalk, so it's not that bad. It may have a natural look to it, but we need to get the weed out of it. And that's an ongoing battle. Is that for a low maintenance, you need to know how you're going to manage a plant after you plant it. But this one hasn't been maintained and just needs some maintenance work. Just a Saturday will take care of its issues. So if you want it there, that's fine. I'm not judging that. It's just, it's not maintained and needs some work. And then why would you put this around the base of the tree? I don't get this at all. So this is not common sense. That should just be a mulch around the base of that tree. These should not be there that close. There's no reason for that. And then we'd have a simple landscape. And the reason why we want to mulch around the base of the tree, why would I want to mulch around the base of this tree for a low maintenance landscape? Have any ideas?
Keep the weeds down.
Keep the weeds down and keep away from mower blight. Because when you're mowing, people get in a hurry and they bang up the side of the tree. And if they're not in a hurry, then they always have to be careful when they're mowing around the trunk, or they should be. Because that's living tissue that's going into the soil. So we don't want to be bumping that. And maybe that's why they put that up there, thinking they're protecting the trunk. But they just need a mulch going around there so that you don't have to mow it. So you don't have weeds and you don't have to mow right by the trunk. So then when we're doing our mowing of our turf, it can go quicker and not be such an issue and damage the tree. Wrong way. No, this is the right way. No, then we have plants that do not have good health. So ornamental plums can get black rot, which is a fungus that grows on it that can kill the branches, and you have to prune it out and catch it early. I've seen them before when they asked me what to do, and I said, well, there's one pruning cut left. That's the base of the plant because it's throughout the canopy. But we just want to make sure that we know why this is not defoliated. And why this is defoliated. I think I see something black down there. That could be that organism I'm talking about. But you know, so whenever we have a plant that's not healthy, we need to investigate why it's not looking good. And then ornamental plants are not like corn. We had tar spot in corn this year, and tar spot went throughout our corn, reducing our yield. We had, if you saw planes flying over cornfields, they were probably spraying a fungicide controlled tar spot. So, and the corn was impacted by that. But it's okay. The corn is an annual plant. It's going to die. We're just going after a yield. When we're looking at ornamental plants, we want them to look attractive. Is that attractive? Would you be proud of that in your landscape? We could see what's causing part of it to be dead, and it's deciduous, so it can fill back in. We probably want to reduce the size of those so they look more bushy. How the appearance is right now. So we can try to correct with pruning, and just see how it comes out. But right now, it's not adding value to that house. Healthy landscape adds value to a house. A negative landscape is going to detract from your value because no one's going to want to buy your house if you want to sell it, because they just see all the work they have to do right after they buy it. Nobody wants to re-landscape a house. I worked with a lady, they went for years, and what they would do is buy homes, redo the landscape so it looked fresh and neat, and do some painting and things, fixing up the interiors and stuff as they lived in, then resell that house because they increased the value because the curb appeal went up, and people walked in the house and didn't see maintenance jobs they had to do. So they fixed those issues, and they did that several times to accumulate some wealth. We can see this tree is having issues. It's not growing straight up, which is what a tree will do. So it probably had some issue of shading that caused it to grow not vertically. And then we are having some root issues down here. So that could be a good candidate just to remove and evaluate that area and replant with something that will do better in that spot. Because when plants don't have good health, we're not going to have a low maintenance landscape. We're going to have a problem. So do you think all these plants in Plymouth are just naturally variegated, or is it could be a nutrient deficiency? So when we see tissue like this, and I see it a lot on our street, maple trees in Plymouth, we're our borderline on manganese, and that deficiency will cause striping in the leaves, and any nutrient, when we talk about plant nutrition, if it's deficient, it's hurting the plant. So it's just not, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, the big three. The macronutrients are important, but the micronutrients are just as important. Due to let's see, in southern Indiana it was magnesium, up here it's manganese, and actually magnesium is a macronutrient. Manganese is a micronutrient, but because of our soils being naturally pH at 7, it's less available to the plants. So this is one of those nutrients. Actually, if it's an acidic soil, it's more available to the plants. So acid-loving plants, that's one of those nutrients it needs more of. That's why it likes the acid soil. So we can foliar feed them, or we can try to use a fertilizer around them to try and get some taken up with fertilizers that have micronutrients in it. But one problem in the city of Plymouth, usually it's a two-part problem. It's one, the tree really doesn't have that much root space to pull in the nutrients it needs, and then we are borderline manganese deficient anyways. This could be iron too. There's other nutrients, and that's why soil testing that I'll talk about is an action step to do can help you determine what's going on your property. Because acidifying the soil will be another solution too, because that's going to release micronutrients if the pH is really high. So don't get excited, particularly if you have a mushroom you can eat if it's growing on your tree, because it's slowly digesting your tree. The fungus itself, we need to remember, is not what you see. This is the fruiting body. The fungus is growing inside of the tree. And the reason why it's growing here is because this tree was damaged. And, so water is setting in this open area, creating a good environment for that fungus to start growing in the trunk. But you see these also just at the base of the tree, and you don't have any damage to the tree, just growing around the base. And then people call me and ask me why they just died overnight. They didn't just die overnight. The fungus has been consuming inside of your tree over years. And finally, it got to the point where it couldn't thrive anymore. So we don't want to see things we can eat growing off the side of our trees. And I'm not saying that's edible. Purdue University does not let me diagnose if it's edible or not when it comes to a mushroom. There's too much risk. And as far as mushroom goes, just remember the saying, there are old mushroom hunters and there's bold mushroom hunters, but there's no old mushroom hunters. So we just want to observe our plants. Insects could be causing this damage here. And what we need to do is address it early. Mites can be just reduced by spraying the tree on a regular basis, but you don't want to let it get to this point. But you want to diagnose what's causing the problem to properly treat it. But that's common with don't need them. Sorry.
No, sorry.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
I was just thinking, sorry, and I'm back to your last slide. I'm so sorry. The mushrooms, what would you suggest if we found fungus like that on the tree? What would you suggest?
I would be looking for a replacement. Planting it. This little tree will probably stay here for several years. But what get one going in the neighborhood so that you have something to replace it with. There's no way to fix this tree once that fungus is in there, because if you kill the fungus, you kill the tree. Because how do you kill funguses? You heat it up to the point where it's dead. So if you have it in your soil, mushrooms growing up, if it's in an open spot where there's sun, you can put out like clear plastic, and on a hot day that could help sterilize the soil. Or you can dig up the organic matter. Where if you dig up the organic matter, the tree is dead. You're taking out all that where it's grown. If I heat it up, you just kill the cambium layers, so the tree is dead. So there's no way to that I know of to correct this fungus. Funguses are hard to control. I have a master gardener that got anthracnose, which is a fungus, into his lungs, and they can't totally cure him. So even in people, there's no way to really sometimes totally kill a fungus. So in this case, the two ways to kill it would kill the tree. And it wouldn't be worth the effort, because by the time this scab's over, this is going to be hollow in the inside, and that's going to be a structural issue with this tree. So it's on the list to be replaced. If it's right by my house or leaning towards my house, it'd probably get replaced sooner. But if it's sturdy and still growing, and you look at the canopy and it's all leafed out and look healthy, I would just start a tree in the neighborhood and enjoy this one for a little longer. And then as my other tree starts growing and getting bigger, I'd remove it.
Okay. Sorry, I should have asked that earlier.
No, that's okay. Hopefully that's not your tree.
No, I hope not too. I don't think so, but no.
Think a lightning strike from that, or just too many?
Yeah, that could have been a lightning strike. I mean, we just have to know the history of the tree, and so if that crack goes all the way up, that would be a pretty big lightning strike.
Yeah.
Usually when they're that strong, it kills the tree. But it could have been something else, some rot that just started feeding down that side due to damage from something else. But lightning could have been that.
So if you see mushrooms in your yard, is it the same idea then? I mean that.
Yeah, so if you have mushrooms, they're not, you don't see anything it's a fruiting body. That's what a mushroom is. So the fungus is living on organic matter in the soil. So we can get mushrooms growing in our natural mulch. And sometimes they're really bad organisms. We have ones that called stinkhorns. When they produce their fruiting body, they stink, So that's nice. We have some that grows in mulches that looks like someone threw up, literally, just like a mess is there. And then we have another one called alt. It's I'm not gonna say it right, but it actually will shoot black spots on the side of your house that you can't get off. So if there's funguses growing in your mulch, dig up the mulch and just get rid of that. That's what it's in there someplace. So I dig up the mulch, get rid of it. In your yard, it just depends on if it annoys you or not. Maybe it's morels if you want. Or big puffballs, which I don't know why people eat them. They don't taste like anything. But then my dad would get morels, and he'd be excited about them. He'd bread them in a beer bread.
Yeah.
And then he throws it in the grease, By the time you get done, I don't think it matters what's in the center. It's tastes good. Well, what's the issue here? This tree was not properly supported after it was planting because you may need to stake a tree just to get it to where it's firmly established in the soil, the roots grow out. Because anything that's containerized or balled in burlap, it takes not long. It's amazing how fast it happens, but usually a year before it's firmly settled into the soil. So a little staking can help prevent that from happening. This could be just a sunlight issue or damage over here that's giving it its leaning characteristic here. It has a weak link here. See how that branch is going straight up? So that branch should not be on this tree, but no one was pruning it. So we create an issue there where rot can set in. I've got pictures showing that. Then we have damage at the base of this tree. So my rule of thumb is you have to have 2/3 good trunk at the base to even consider keeping a tree. And that one's borderline, it needs to go. So we have that issue, we have this issue. So when you're looking at evaluating your trees in your landscape, just take note of these things and see how healthy your trees are, because dead ash trees that are falling apart, you don't get the grace that is just Mother Nature, because you know you have a hazard. So that could be an issue. If this tree falls over, actually, I guess the good news from a liability standpoint, it's a tree that fell over. So whoever it hits, insurance has to take care of it. But if it falls on your house, guess what? It's your insurance that has to take care of it. So whenever a tree is unsafe, it should be removed and replaced with a healthy tree. So that would be a concern for me. This one just wasn't staked properly. So I would just try to see if I can get it uprighted and properly staked until it gets established. So that's a planting issue. This is a major tree health issue going on with this tree. So that one needs to be removed. That one just needs help. This tree looks healthy, but there was some issue here. It could have been when it was young. It had sun scald and it split then. Now it's growing together. It could be a minor lightning strike. I don't know, but we have a minor issue here, but this one doesn't worry me. So that's how you have to evaluate your trees, is look at them and see if the bark's together and the trunk is healthy. We're not so concerned. That tree can be there as long as it has a nice root flare at the base of the trunk and the overall tree health is looking good. Did this one have any leafing issues?
I think this one had some branches that were dead up high, but my tree at home had this similar thing happen, and I think it happened after we had that good rain. Probably about a week after that, I noticed this kind of crack up my tree.
Because that's what sun scald is, where that's usually a winter event where you get sun warming up the trunk on a sunny, clear day, and then when the sun goes down, the temperature dramatically changes, and the tree can't adjust the bark quick enough to that rapid change in temperature. So instead of just being okay to, as it gets colder, condense, it cracks, where that at that union. So this could be, it could be a growth issue too. So that's what that looks more like to me, is some kind of event like that, because it's not that severe and it's together. The trouble is when you get a side that's damaged, that's far apart, it may take, by the time it grows together, you have that hollow spot in the trunk. So it's an issue of safety for the length of the tree. So when we're doing our landscape checkup, we want to just make sure we don't have any trees that have hollow trunks in them. That could be an issue. Okay, this is an example of a neglected shrub. We got a lot of damaged wood in it that needs to be removed. So it's going to take a little time to regenerate it, prune that one. I'm going to show you a video of doing that. I prune this one, so to get so the sections that you have to do to get it back right. So, that'll show you that probably next week.
Oh.
And I can be here.
No.
I'll send you.
Yeah, that'd be great.
And then, just looking at this bed, we do need to remove this material because that's boisterous blight. So if you're thinking of leaving material in your landscape to give a habitat for the insects to live there, you gotta make sure that it's healthy. So anytime you have diseased material, it needs to be removed because the disease will overwinter on that leaf material. So if you have a grape arbor and you have diseased leaves and diseased grapes, if you don't want it next year, you clean all that up underneath it. Perennial flower beds, that's why we have diseases going on. Hostas, if they're healthy, they can just be left there. But you want to be sure to observe, what's going on with your plants before you don't remove it. That's an invasive plant, so you don't want that in your flower bed, so you need to remove that. So this time of year, that's what we need to do is go get all the perennial plants that start growing in your beds out of there if you haven't done it already. And clean up the ones and get the disease out of it so we have a nice bed to start fresh the next year. So it's a great time to do that. And then just think about diseases. If you have lilacs, you got powdery mildew. If you don't like that, don't have lilacs. You can spray for it. There's sprays for diseases. Let me see hands. How many of you actually spray fungicides in your landscape? Notice my hand didn't go up. I mean, I don't have time because spraying once does nothing. You have to do multiple sprays to actually control a disease. Just like they had to spray cornfields, believe it or not, like 2 times in some cases this year, but that is not very economical for them to do it too often.
So there's a fungus that's growing on lilacs, because one of my lilacs has a lot of, looks like fungus on it.
This powdery stuff on the leaf, I call it natural dusting that occurs on my plant, and I enjoy it. I'm making a joke, but it's just susceptible to powdery mildew. And if you look at pumpkins in the area now, most of them have got diseases on them too that come in the fall of the year. The cooler temperatures, there's diseases that are just more aggressive in that cooler weather. So this could be happening in the spring on lilacs when it's cool, or in the fall is a typical time that it gets on there. But the leaf is still doing photosynthesis. The fungus is living in the tissue. So that's why when I say we spray fungicides, we spray it before we see this to prevent it. Because spraying a fungicide does not kill the disease. So we got to spray it before we see it if we want to control it. Okay, let me tell me what you think. Get your input. This tree it's fully leafed out, but all the leaves are tiny. That's a third of the normal size of that maple. This is the base of the tree. Do you think there's anything going on with the base of that tree that could be causing the leaves to be small?
I don't see a flare much on that.
I don't either. And I even see a root growing on the surface right beside it. So I'd be getting my shovel out, checking out to see if there's girdling roots that are impacting that tree. Because if the leaves are small because of it, it's a year or 2 away from being dead from girdling roots if they're there. Because when you create a hard container that as roots hit that will create them turning back onto that tree. And the big issue is we're seeing the top, but we may have to dig down a foot to see how the full impact, depending on how deep this hard structure goes.
So you're thinking that edging, I mean, that only goes down about 4 inches with that.
But if we have a root coming off below that area, it could hit that edging and turn back. That's the concern.
Wow.
So I wouldn't put edging around my trees. I would just use mulch. I mean, edging can go other places, but not around that close to a tree
Mhm.
because depending on how hard of a surface that edging is, a root's not gonna grow through it. So what choice does it have? Well, it does sometimes. I've seen roots go find a spot in the edging and grow through it. But if you get a root growing from the base and get started, but I don't know, you gotta dig and find out.
So if you
So
dig down and you find a root like that, can you cut that out and remedy the situation, or is it?
I volunteered to help someone that did that edging thing and filled in with soil. And it was a challenge. I've got a video to show of me dealing with a girdling root this week on a tree that didn't have that environment to create it, so it was more of a minor issue and it's easy to do. So, but you gotta dig down and see what you have and make that determination on what, if there's a root problem, then yeah, you can remove the roots that are causing, because eventually that root is just gonna grow into the side of the tree. What's going to happen, and I've seen trees that have been killed by it. So whenever I see a tree that looks like a stump in the ground and it's having growth issues, I would at least check that. My educator that sent me this, I said, well, I would use a shovel to pull it back and just see what's going on because we don't know. Assumptions are just being made, but there does look like there's an issue down here. Visually to me, but need to investigate to see it because I got a root growing right there. I've got one right there, but what's down deeper,
Is that damage on the right side of the tree also on the trunk, or is that just?
It looks like there's some damage to it. But the educator this was an arborist that took this picture. He knows more about than I do. He wasn't worried about the trunk and he was confused. He sent it off to our specialist at Purdue and he said, I'd dig down in that soil and see what's going on. Because it's something happening at the base of that tree because the whole tree is being equally impacted. So it's not a disease, it's not a nutrient issue. It's right there. So something's happening there. So we have to figure out what's going on. Because if we're going to leave the stress that's causing these leaves to be so small, the tree can survive because the branches are still healthy. They're just not getting enough water and nutrients up to them. Probably getting plenty of nutrients, not water. But the other nutrients that come in with the water they want to get.
Can we assume that root ball is probably not real wide? I mean, if there's a good rain or something, it's gonna be maybe top heavy or not necessarily.
Well, the roots below it could be growing well out into the yard, so that may not be root bound.
Okay.
The real problem is I said that last week, is that you get a bald and burlap and you just plant at the level that it is bald at. That's not the level it grew at in the nursery. So you plant it too deep, even though it doesn't look like you mounted soil on top. But this was planted that far too deep, you just generated girdling roots by planting it too deep. And then that is what's growing out and hitting stuff. So you don't necessarily have to mount soil on top of it. You can just make the mistake of planting it too deep.
Yeah, it just looks like they stuck a dowel rod right in the ground. It's just-
And these issues take time to develop. I mean, the person that planted this tree, if it was paid for, was long gone. And then just another tree with root issues. So, roots going away from the tree. You want to make sure you don't. This is where mulch comes in, is to protect them. And we just got major issues going on at the base of this tree. And then this would be what we call a girdling root because it's right beside the tree. You can see that. And these are the roots I'd be worried about. So I'd be digging down to see if I could remove them. If the tree has enough value to do the work, because it's got a couple of issues we see in the trunk.
And that looks like one that I had. It was an ash tree and it was doing that. And lots of those roots going. I mean, I was always hitting it with the mower.
So the roots growing out from the tree, you just want to mulch around them or mow over them, but you don't cut them out. Some people cut them out. Roots grow where they always want to be for oxygen and moisture. So removing a root really is not the solution if it's a root that's supporting the tree. These roots by the tree is what we need to investigate and to thoroughly see what we need to do. We got to dig down. But you can see this one's buried into the side of the tree. So that is a good example of probably a girdling root, because the trunk is actually growing over the top of the root. And that root is growing into the side of the tree at the same time it's growing over the top of it. So eventually it's going to impact the cambium layer of moving nutrients. So that's a good example of how we're concerned about this.
So strangle itself.
Yeah, that's what they do. Over time. So this tree needs to come down. That could be mower damage initially, that could be whatever, but you know, and sometimes what happens is we still have bark on this other side that's keeping the tree alive. Then you get in summer stress and it dies. I get the phone call that it died overnight. But we have, again, an unprotected base of a tree. You know, so when they're mowing and they're using a riding mower, then the son is mad because he has to mow, because he has plans to go out that night. The last thing he's worried about is hitting that base of that tree. You know, he just wants to get the mowing job done so that he can get in his car and go have his fun at night. And so if we don't make our mowing environment simple, you know, that he's in a hurry, so he just has to do a quick turn around the mulched area around that tree, he doesn't hit. We can alleviate damage to our trees. But when we put them out in the yard being a target, damage can occur. So things like that can build up over time. One time someone called me, the tree died overnight and it was just one strip of bark that's keeping that tree alive, and it's weeding injury. So we gotta be careful. This is what's happening with those multi-trunk trees. See, this is all rot because that branch that fell off was only attached partially to the tree and had bark that was growing into that tree and is not really protected. So that's why if we could, when these trees are young, we make them central leaders. So this weakness in these multi-trunk trees doesn't exist. And you can see where there's an opening here where water's getting down in there, rotting that tree. So we always want to make sure that we have a multi-trunk tree that's not happening to our tree. Because that was a large one that came off that tree. And it wasn't pruned off, so the damage isn't stopping at the bottom of my picture. It went well down the trunk. It says that limb pulled off, it pulled a lot of bark off below it by the weight of the tree coming off. Okay, this is an old picture. This is a picture from southern Indiana. Someone planted all these blue spruces throughout their 40-acre property, and they all look like that. You know, so he called me too late, number one. But it's that needle cast disease on blue spruces that spread to all the trees. So he was wanting to fix the problem, but I had no solution for him to fix it. Because you're not going to spray. I mean, look at that tree. It's already really weak. So when we're thinking about landscaping, we want to think about checking how durable the tree is in our environment. Does that make sense? If you're planting an ash tree, that means you have to treat it. So those don't make sense anymore either. What do you think about this turf? Have any thoughts?
When you see brown spots,
I know, it's,
Yeah.
yeah, on both sides. but-
So it's a beautiful house. This guy's a carpenter. He bought this house. It's amazing because he had this on both wings. He built this after he bought the house, and it was a master gardener trip to this property to look at all of his beautiful beds. He was breeding hostas and a lot of meat hostas. He also made wine. The wine was really good. But,
So he's got hostas around the base of his tree, now that's okay?
but he didn't make a raised bed.
Okay, okay,
So you can mulch around a tree and plant into that mulch and that's fine.
Okay.
It's not changing the level of soil on the trunk.
okay,
So if you have a bed in that mulch, you can plant fun stuff in that mulch like hostas and different perennial plants and enjoy your landscape. Just don't make the raised bed that people do. So you don't have to just have plain mulch, you can plant into it. Should have made that point. And it's a beautiful.
that's pretty. I like
So he did that throughout his landscape and maintained it meticulously. And it's not, the lawn is green, you know, so that's not an issue. It's just, we're having some issues possibly with the mowing height and maybe even the fertility of the lawn itself. His focus was on all his beds and they were immaculate. I mean, he'd come home from work and pull weeds every night. So more work than I'd want, but it's beautiful. So when we're thinking of turf, the main thing on turf always is what? What's the first thing you gotta do with turf? Have it healthy. No, there's this more simple thing,
Water.
mowing height. When you buy a lawnmower at Lowe's, it's a push mower, you just put it on the very highest position because they don't make it where it can. Because you want, after you mow it, you want it to be at least 3 inches after it's mowed. You know, so if you're mowing shorter than that, you can be scalping areas, and some of that could have happened because it has change of elevations where you're going lower than whatever height you have it set at. And mowing tall actually is the low maintenance landscape option because then it shades out other weeds from growing. And you'll tend to have more turf that you're managing versus other plants. And then the second thing is fertilizing with nitrogen. And so the main time you want to fertilize nitrogen is what season? Nope,
Oh,
summer.
late summer. If you're going to only fertilize once, do it late summer, because your turf needs nitrogen then, and it has positive growth. So, you know, in August to early September, no reason to put it out there if it's dormant and hot. Wait till the weather settles down and give it that fertilizer. Then you're going to fertilize again. When's the next time you fertilize? Now to early November. So you do it late summer, and then you do it late fall, and that will build the factory, because that's when the plant has positive growth. In the spring of the year, the plant wants to regrow. So it's always stressing itself out to regrow. So we don't want to fertilize early spring, but mid-spring, give it some fertilizer to help it out at that point. And only if you irrigate, or we have one of those beautiful, cool, moist summers, would we fertilize in summertime. So
What do you consider mid-spring then, what month?
May, before June, in May when it's still actively growing. You don't want to fertilize it when it's not actively growing, but you don't want to fertilize it in April because that's just going to stimulate more mowing. I had a coworker at Purdue University. I used to manage the Purdue sheep unit. He managed the beef finishing unit. So he had access to free fertilizer. So he over fertilized his yard. So he's mowing every 3rd day. So if you want to mow every 3rd day, just give it fertilizer in early spring. But it does need some if that's your program. But if you want to fertilize this once a year, do it late summer. 2 times a year, late summer, late October, early November. 3 times in mid-spring. So those are just questions you can think about, and I'll move on. We finished that presentation. I mean, just always be thinking this time of year, does your public space make your home inviting? Does your private space, this is for you, meet your entertainment, hobby needs? How can you correct it if it's not? How much time do you want to spend on landscape maintenance? That's, before you plant everything and have issues, you want to think that through and plant properly to reduce that. And always plant so the plant has its ability to do its chore space. That's the big one. Do not, do you have a problem plant? Get rid of it. This is just more of a straightforward program, and I may be using that word to talk about some. This is just action steps we can do in this time of year to make our landscapes better. And guess what one is? Soil testing. So when we're in this time of the year, things that we can do. It's a great time of the year to clean up our beds, not only just removing the debris, but taking out plants that are maybe invasive that's growing in there. There's plenty of things that will start growing. We got to do the weeding throughout the year. But when you're cleaning up your beds, it's a good time to make sure there's no woody perennials that are getting established and going to be a perennial problem. And we have a lot of weeds that are very aggressive if you let them take over. Field bindweed is one that is a perennial plant that grows from year to year. So it can be a binding plant that's a problem that just will pop in there. We want to remove perennial weeds or treat them with a herbicide this time of the year. This time of the year, perennial plants are trying to store up carbohydrates just like our perennial plants we want. So if we make them sick now, they're going to be less likely to overwinter. So this is actually the best time to use a herbicide on them. Or, you know, if you can pull them out and root them up, you can do that too, but it's your choice. Or if you don't want to pull them up, you know, if you have a woody plant that's growing, you may want to just cut it back and treat it with a herbicide. There's a couple of herbicides you can use that can kill it that way. But this is the time to go after your perennial weeds, whether they're in your lawn or in your other landscape or growing on your trees. And growing on your trees, all you have to do is cut the vine, right? You don't want to try and yank the vine out of the tree because you don't know what's going to come down on top of you. You know, just cut it and let it die, and you can go up higher and cut it off. But if you're a good observer of your landscape, you catch it when it just is growing out of the ground and starting to grow on the side of your tree, so you can cut it and remove it. Isn't that the ease of the landscape? Is just instead of waiting till now, just once a month, walk your landscape and see if there's something growing someplace or something happening that needs to be addressed. Because if you're like me during the week, you're too busy. On weekends, if you're like my son-in-law, he goes to Purdue football games, weddings, never home on his weekend. With my daughter, they just go every place on weekends. So they never have time to look. So at least one day a month, really look at your landscape. Determine landscape plant maintenance. That is, if you're mowing and you're always doing this because of a limb, it needs to go, right? So you need to get limbs out of your way that's making it harder to do your routine maintenance of your yard. If there's limbs, as the leaves fall off of them, it's easy to see if you have healthy or damaged limbs. So you got all winter to prune. Once you get to November, you can start pruning your trees because it's not going to regrow until spring. And it's cold temperatures, so there's no right time to do pruning. The only thing you don't want to prune now is anything that you have because it's going to bloom in the spring. Like you don't want to do heavy pruning of lilacs now because you want that flush of color in the spring. Right? So you want to wait till after it blooms to prune it. But now is a good time, you know, to just see what needs to be done to make those notes. Particularly your lawn, we want to fertilize to make sure it has adequate nutrients. Trees can utilize as much nitrogen as our lawn. In fact, woody ornamentals could use up to 4 pounds of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet a year. So fertilizing our lawn, it's not just fertilizing the lawn, it's fertilizing your woody ornamentals. The nitrogen is going to go through the soil and the trees going to be taken out, or shrubs that are close to where you fertilize. Make sure all plants have adequate water. They do.
Yeah.
So take account for that. Take a soil sample to determine nutrient needs. You don't do that every year. You do it every 3 to 5 years, you know, just so you know where your pH is. What is pH? That's the acidity of your soil. Our soils like to be slightly acidic. Some plants like it very acidic. And you don't grow many plants that like it neutral. Alfalfa does. Alfalfa, you need to have it at 7.2 before you plant your field alfalfa, but even soybeans do fine at 6.5. And let me just draw this out quick. I'm gonna get to it, talk about fertilizer, but talking about pH, it's a logarithm. You know, so does anyone understand what pH is? You wanna do this for me?
Hydrogen ion concentration.
So, we have 7, that's neutral. You know, so then if you get high, that's alkaline, but becoming more and more like bleach. As you go down, it becomes more and more acidic. Clear down here, the sulfuric acid. Our specialists at Purdue actually had a field that was only 2.8 on the pH scale. So that was like, it almost burned your hand touching that soil. So things weren't growing very well. And then this is actually the range, you know, 5, pH of 5 to 7 that we work in, and 6 in between. Some plants like as low as 4.5, like crazy plants like blueberries that grew up in bogs. But you have to have organic soils, pH is 5. We can't do much to change it. So plants that grew in bogs usually like very acidic soils. So what does this mean? I have all these other nutrients I'm not going to talk about right now, that how available to the plant is determined on the how acidic the soil is. And when it becomes alkaline, there's certain nutrients that are very not available to the plant. So you have nutrient deficiencies like trees that are light colored yellow, like I was showing you, because of manganese, iron, and zinc, and some of the ones that are more available when it's acidic. So we want to know what our soil pH is. We want to know what range it is within this area. And we particularly want to know if it's really acidic, which you're not going to have in this county, or if it's really alkaline. So that's why we do a soil test to know how available the nutrients are. Then it tests the nutrients to tell us if it's high, medium, or low. You have a publication tonight on this, so I'm not going to go in great detail on this, but knowing what your soil is just important as a baseline to know. And then once you have a level, if everything's pretty good, you don't need to test it for 3 to 5 years. But it impacts how often you have to test is if you have a sandy soil or a beautiful loam soil. A loam soil is one that just has a good equal particle size of the minerals that allows it to hold on to nutrients and water. Sandy soils holds on to nothing. Clay soils are just, they hold on to a lot. I know, funny. Have you ever lived on a clay soil? I have. You got 2 days to work it. It goes from too wet to too dry, just like that. But most of our soils tend to be sandy loams in this county, which are pretty easy to work with. So that's the good thing. Unless you go to the desert part of our county, which is to the west side of it, where they have a lot of sandy soil. Then you just have to use irrigation to manage those properties. So review the hardscape condition is something you can do this time of the year. Just check if you need to do any maintenance on your property. I mean, so if your deck is it still sturdy? Do we need why we want to do it now is if you have any cracks that need to be filled in, you want to do it before winter because water going in there freezing and thawing can make it worse, right? So this is the time of year we want to make sure if we have any cracks that we seal them before we go into the winter months. So cleaning flower beds, I already talked about this. One thing I didn't talk about is anything like if anyone grows tomato plants and has a wire cage that needs to be disinfected, because tomato plants have diseases on them every year, and that disease will be on that cage to be a source to infect the plant next year. So not only do you have to clean up the vegetables, but you need to clean that up. So any support structure, if you have a perennial plant that dies back to the soil, or if you have a annual plant that dies off, probably should be cleaned and disinfected.
You disinfect them with.
10% bleach solution or some other disinfectant like that, just
Okay.
and wear gloves to protect yourself when you're doing it. But just wipe it down is what you want to do with some type of disinfectant
Okay.
to remove it off that surface.
I've never heard of that.
Treat and remove perennial weeds. Plant a cover crop in annual beds that aren't growing in the winter time, to have something growing there instead of weeds. That's why we plant cover crops, to build the soil with new roots going into it. But also you can get a lot of annual weeds growing in it that may not be good for the site. You guys have other suggestions? What do you do your beds in this time of year other than this?
I have a question about, ground, what's a good ground cover for a shady area?
Is it shady in the winter time?
Yeah,
Yeah.
because there's a lot of trees on the east side of it. And there's a lot of trees right over it.
Okay, well, the grasses would prefer sun, but you could use some tillage radishes. We have a site called Midwest Cover Crops, and it'll list all kinds of cover crops that you can plant and when you need to plant them. But any plant that you plant is going to grow up and start greening up. So with cover crops, it's not so much that we need a lot of growth. So even the rye or that you can plant and just remove in the spring, or you could do something like oats and radishes, and they'll winter kill. So they'll give you some growth and then they die off when it gets really cold and you don't have to deal with killing them in the spring. So something like that's easy to do that doesn't cause you any problem. So ideally you would have them planted towards the end of August. So if you have something that's open then, that'd be a good thing to use. But spring oats, you can, they will winter kill. Regular oats won't, so we have winter oats and spring oats. Winter oats are like weed. So all those are not that hard to control in the spring of the year. The cool thing about rye is you can actually, when it's blooming in the spring, you can just not crimp it with a, I think what I would use is a board with ropes on it, and kind of walk on it and crimp it. Then you have your mulch, because they'll just die and you can plant into that mulch. Just need to remember to account for giving a little nitrogen, because that rye tends to be a plant that can absorb some of the nitrogen out of the soil as it breaks down. So you need to compensate a little bit for that. But there's, multiple things you can plant. I mean, clovers is something else you can do. It depends on how you manage that site in the spring of the year. If you till it under, then there's a multiple things you can plant. Does that help?
I don't know. I'm gonna have to check out the site.
Yeah, I wrote that down too.
Yeah, they list a large list of plants you can use to cover crops, and they'll tell you why you're planting them. And then they also, for Barstow County, they tell you when you can plant them. So there's a period in time that you can plant them. So that tells you when it's too late to plant them. So it has a lot of useful information.
Is there anything you would suggest for a perennial that would grow in that same area, like a shady area like that?
Yeah, we have a publication on those. So hostas like shade. There's a lot of shade plants. We have a master gardener that knows all of them, but there's a large list of shade plants that like to grow in shady areas. So it's just
Deer like to eat them too, though. But we have a lot of deer, so. Yeah, they'd be eaten.
well, there's things that die back in the winter and come up in the spring too that are perennials that they may not eat as much, So we have a publication. I'll get that. No, there's lot of plants that like shade. And some of them, well, like my, it's more aggressive, but my archangel, it thrives in shade. And deer can eat it all. If it eats it, it probably won't. That'd be a ground cover. So you want a plant, don't you, versus a ground cover.
Well, I'm thinking more of a ground cover that just stays there all the time. So we don't have to mow that area and then.
Sure. Okay. Have a presentation on that. I'll review it. But no, there's a lot of shade plants. That's what's cool, because this thing about all the woods, Indiana used to be 85% woods. So there's just a lot of native shade plants, because anything that grew underneath that canopy is a shade, definitely was a shade plant. Oh, this time of year is the time to go get, Price Nurseries is shutting down, so if you want a nice bald and burlap tree, maybe we'll get a deal, because the person that bought the ground does not want trees. So it's just gonna be gone after the next
Oh,
year.
wow.
So but this time of year, you can still plant a bald and burlap. I mean, last year, they were planting trees clear through November. They're still warm enough to set them in the ground. So you just need to have adequate space for a mature size, the plant that it's gonna be. The hole is the depth of the tree that it should be grown at, so we don't wanna undermine by digging too deep. We wanna know the depth we wanna dig, because we wanna set that plant, whether it's a container plant or a bald burlap, on solid foundation so it doesn't sink. Because we want to keep that crown at soil height or a little raised of that plant, which is the root flare that will tell us where that is. So you want the whole, like, 1 to 1.5 the size of the root system that you're trying to plant, so it has good loose soil to grow into. Because the first thing we want to do is get that root to grow out into the landscape, not have a girdling root. And if you have sides slanted, that will tend to not have it bounce back, and loosen the soil a little bit on that edge to make sure it can go in to the soil. The soil that's the hardest to work with is a clay-based soil, because it's easy to make the sides of the hole you dig actually fairly hard to grow into, if you're not careful, just because of the material. We want to remove all foreign material off the bald and burlap. It's your tree, so if it has a cage on it, you want to get rid of it. You want to remove 1/3 of that wrap material. You do this once it's in the hole, and then you make sure the roots are going to grow out and not around. So you can check that. If it's a newly bald and burlap tree, it's not going to be that way, but if it's a tree they held over for a year, it's more likely to be that problem, because the roots have been growing in that ball. And then we always want to fill back with native soil, and we don't really want to fertilize the tree to stimulate a lot of new growth. What Price Nurseries did, which is really neat, is they would dig them before they broke dormancy. So the tree they didn't have to prune it back. Because if you dig a tree that's already actively growing, it's already grown more growth than the ball can support. But what Price Nurseries did, which was neat, is they dig them before it broke dormancy, so that the tree knew it had a reduced root ball, so it wouldn't grow as much. So too bad we're losing them, because it was a huge asset for our community, but I don't blame them. They're at the age they want to retire and do other things. So this is something we can do this time of year. So the things we want to do, we want a firm foundation to plant that tree into. If we're going into that first winter, we may want to wrap the trees. This is the time of year we would do that to protect them from sun scalding if they are a young tree with a thin bark. We don't want to make this, we want the tree to be able to move and start, but we don't want it to move extremely. A tree is meant to do that. A tree is supposed to do this. We just don't want it doing this, and that's what this is for. So we want that to help give structure to that tree to get the roots established without it whipping too much. But we don't want to make it so tight it doesn't move at all. So it needs some flexibility there.
Bob, is there trees you don't recommend planting in the fall time? Do some trees do better planting in the fall than others?
It's, the reason why I say container and bald and burlap is they have established roots. Bare root, we plant this in the spring of the year to get them off and growing. Planting a bare root now, it may make it, but it may not. You know, so you just increase your probability of having success. The idea with all plantings is you want to do it in a period of time where they're not under stress when they're planted. And you want to give them some time to get into the winter before they're stressed. These, we can plant this late because they have a root system. We get a containerized plant that's actually grown in the container and not just bare roots stuck in the container. It should have a good root system to it, to where it can make it through the winter. And even though we greatly reduce the bald and burlap size of roots, they've got the root structure there to start growing into the soil, and they'll do that if planted in October, before it gets really dormant. And it'll be set up to grow in the spring of the year. So we changed what type of tree we can plant, how it was managed as we go through and you don't want to plant anything in the middle of summer when it's under a lot of stress. Unless that's going to be your full-time occupation, making sure that tree is properly watered and covered with a shade cloth, what it was like in August of this year. It needs shade. You know when a tree is under struggle is when it's getting sun scald, burning of the leaf tips, because it's not getting enough water to the leaves. So that's a good indication, and that happens in some trees that aren't well rooted this August of this year, because there was this extreme weather. So what do we do in the spring of the year if we wrap our trees in the fall of the year? Take them off. Some people don't remember to do that. But you take them off because that's bark and needs to be exposed to the air once it breaks dormancy. And if it's a clay soil, you probably want to do even a larger bed. And with the clay soil, you want to make sure the crown actually is up above the like this is kind of, a raised area for that tree to be in. The worst thing that happens in clay soils is people plant them, they dig the soil, and then the tree settles into the soil, and then that comes like a bathtub when it rains, and that root gets soaked and saturated. So with clay soils, you definitely want to make sure it's actually raised above the surrounding topography, so it just naturally drains. And you may need to make a larger bed to do that in. And you can do that if you're going to do some landscaping, a corner around your house, is just make a large bed and select your plants that are going to go into that, so that you can have plants starting at the, a nice soil to get established into in a bed versus just a single area to plant into. So soil testing, the first thing you got to remember is when you do soil testing is I don't like this picture because there's not enough red dots. You want to take a minimum of 10 subsamples, make one sample. Because if a cat decides to use the spot that you test, you just threw off your whole test, because that's always that issue. You don't know. So at least 10 subsamples means if there's one bad spot, it's been diluted enough, and 15 would be better. Because what we are going to use this as is a baseline to manage our area of that property. And what this is showing, like a vegetable garden, you're going to go deeper because it's going to be the tillage depth. The turf area, you're not going to go as deep because you're not going to till up your soil to work your fertilizer in. So you only needed to know the upper 3 inches, because by applying fertilizer on top, that's the only area you can impact. And for trees, you won't actually go deeper than for a garden area, 8 to 12 inches. The first foot of your soil is 70% of your tree roots. So most of your soil is in the upper foot. And then roots do go deeper, but most of the roots are on that upper foot. So fertilizing that upper foot should take care of that tree. And I gave you that publication tonight, so you have that as a reference. But many samples, we can send the samples in for you at the same Only thing you're gonna have to pay me for is the mailing cost above the cost of getting tested at A&L Labs. Or you can send it directly to them yourselves. And we'll have different testing options you can look at, based upon cost. This is just showing you the lawn fertilizer program. So you can see that November is a fast, so that you can go get urea and apply it when a rain's coming in. You want to apply it out, you don't want it sitting on the soil surface, but you could spread that in November. September, you probably want a slow release fertilizer, depending on when you do it. If you're doing it in late August, actually, because the weather is just nice and productive for the turf growth, because it's cooling off and we got plenty of moisture, you probably want to use a slow release fertilizer. If you're going later into September, that's maybe when you want to switch over to the fast release, because that plant's going to need it quicker. All this is saying is, slow release is that fertilizer was coated, but something has to be worn off before it's released into the soil solution. So the fast release is not protected, so it goes right into the soil solution. And if you have sandy soil, you definitely want to use slow release then. And then mid to late May, depending on what the weather forecast is. I'd want to apply this before we go into severe summer type weather. And who knows what June is going to be in northern Indiana. Some years it's mild weather, if that's the forecast, then late May is fine. If it looks like we're going to have a hotter June, then mid-May makes more sense to me. And this is a slow release fertilizer done if you have a reason to keep your grass growing. If you don't irrigate, you want your turf to go semi-dormant during the hot period of the summer. You still need to water it at least every 4 weeks to keep the crown alive. But unless you can water it on a regular basis, you don't want to stimulate it to grow. So it depends on if you have irrigation or not. It's the key on whether you routinely do the July. Now, if it's a summer that's mild and moist, you should do it. But if you just do want to do it once, number one, this is the order you would do it. 1, 2, 3, and then that is depending upon the weather if you're irrigating. So this is a great time of year to do all kinds of crazy things. The master gardeners just had their plant swap because they go into the perennial beds, and some plants need to be divided, like iris. Eventually you got to divide them to keep them blooming. Same way with daylilies. Peonies never need to be divided, but you can do it if you want to start a new plant. So if you divide a peonies, you're actually going to send them back, and they're not going to be as productive until they get reestablished. And this one, you got to plant, these need to be planted the right height. Grasses, this is a great time to divide those two. So you can give gifts away. So what you do is you divide all these plants up, and then you have gifts to give to people you love. Or if there's someone at the office party, you have to give a Christmas gift together, you save it for them. This is a great time. This is when we plant spring flowering bulbs, so you can begin that in late September. One of the master gardeners, the neighbor, is on a border planting. He'd give her the bulbs as long as she planted them in the spring. So, I mean the fall, so they could all enjoy the spring color. So they had a partnership on it. And then if you grow things that are tender bulbs, you need to dig them. Gladiolus, I've known some people have issues saving those, and they just bought new bulbs each year to plant. The tender bulbs aren't going to make it through the winter, so if we're going to save them, we're going to need to dig them before it gets too cold, and then we're going to store them, let them dry, and store them in some peat moss or vermiculite so they'll overwinter well to replant in the spring. So I had a master gardener that was dug his cannons every year and would have that new ones to share as they divide, so it was a way that but he enjoyed it. So these are things we do in the fall of the year to accent our crop talking about managing weeds. If you're in the city, if you see a low plant like that, you destroy it. Because that's candidate thistle, it grows by rhizomes. But that's not the only one that grows by rhizomes. But we have creeping Charlie, which is covered, it competes with our turf. So it grows with stolons, so it spreads out just like bluegrass does if you don't manage it. So the key is to manage this one early. Don't call me when the whole yard is covered with it, because that's gonna be a job. Plantain is another one that can take over. Dandelion, I mean, there's a lot of perennial plants that can grow in our landscape. They just have to tolerate mowing. But I have a slide when I talk about turf that shows mowing height. And the taller you mow, the less problems you have with dandelions. It tends to be more of a problem when you mow close to the soil. So in our flower beds, woody ornamentals, you want to make sure there's no vines you don't want growing. What's amazing to me is people actually come up to me and find perennial plants in their landscape, and they ask me if it's a good plant. You're not that one. But something growing there that's not supposed to be there. It's not good. Kill it. Just kill it and don't worry about it. Perennial plants don't cost that much. Get the cultivar you want, even if it's something you want. Even something like a goldenrod, they have so many cultivars of goldenrod that look so much neat, cooler than our native goldenrod. There's nothing wrong with goldenrod, but they make these new ones, these cultivars, that it almost looks like you're having a show how brilliantly they flower and present themselves. So even things like ironweed, there's cultivars we plant. The native ones just aren't as ornate as what you can buy. So I would suggest it's still a native plant. It's just we've taken that native cultivar and developed it into a more showy plant. So you can get anything. So just assume it's bad. Tree of Heaven needs to be changed its name. There's nothing heavenly about it except for when it flowers. But it's weak wood, so it's dangerous. And they are all over Plymouth, so if you think you got a walnut growing and you're not sure, give it a little time, because it'll make evident how soft the wood is. And it really doesn't look like a walnut, just at a glance it does. And then we have other things like garlic, mustard, mints that can be taken over these areas. So just check it out. We have mints that you really aren't supposed to even eat, that's invasive, that can get going. So just make sure you know what your plants are this time of the year. And if you don't know, they're out. They're gone. Unless you won the Powerball lately, don't assume you get lucky that a beautiful native plant doesn't. And it can. I mean, if you like wild cherries, I have one growing that I may transplant in my landscape that's coming up. So if you know what it is, you may want to keep it. This is just normal, in the fall of the year, we have needles on some evergreens because the older needles drop. That's just how a tree grows. The older needles turn brown and drop. It's just more dramatic on white pine and some trees because they're so brilliant in color when they do it, that people notice it and think there's something wrong with their tree. But then we have trees that are deciduous evergreens too, that just drop all their needles.
Should evergreens be trimmed up around the base of the tree, get those branches up off the ground, or is that fine?
Oh, yeah.
That's fine. I mean, it's the appearance. What happens though with some trees like spruces is we have a canker disease that gets on the lower branches, and you see people trimming them up, but they're probably just trimming out dead wood. And before you know it, you have like the umbrella effect. So it's kind of neat if you like that, have a picnic underneath your tree. It works, but it's not a natural look to the tree like it would be in nature. And usually I think when I see those pruned up, I think it's that disease, because they'll take out the lower branches first. And then eventually, that disease will not kill the tree. Needle cast disease will on blue spruces. But what you end up with is ugly trees eventually, because the canker disease just kind of sits there until there's a wound in the limb, then it goes in. So knowing these problematic parts of your tree. But then in a landscape, no plant should be considered permanent. It's there until its value is gone. So when the value is gone of a plant, you remove it and replace it with a new plant. Because you're supposed to have joy in your landscape, not be looking at something you think that's just horrible. Well, then if it's horrible, get rid of it. Moga pines, if you are not careful, they just get huge and they just need to be replaced. They no longer, because you can't prune it back hard because it's an evergreen. So Price's Nurseries always said that after 20 years, all landscapes need to be redone. You know, and as a homeowner, you can be doing this when you want to do it. You know, so you see a plant that's no longer attractive to you, it's gone. There's nothing moral or immoral about killing a plant. If it's not attractive to you, it's time to replace it. And you can keep getting a fresher landscape by doing that. So that's what I mean by this time of year, we should look around and see what plants do we like, what plants do we not like, what plants have been a nightmare because they get disease. Crab apples have resistance to apple scab until they don't. Then when they don't, you have to spray them in the spring several times. And who wants to spray ornamental trees? I can vote on that. I don't. So that's the time to get rid of that tree and get a new crab apple that's a newer cultivar that's resistant to it. So you're not doing that maintenance problem. I always remember the tree at the Washington, Indiana post office. It was beautiful crab apple tree in the spring. By July, it was defoliated because it was so susceptible to that disease. But when it was planted, it was resistant to that disease. And it was not a maintenance issue. So as soon as a plant becomes a maintenance issue, my recommendation, because we all have limited time. I mean, I don't care if it's fishing, playing golf, you got stuff you want to do for the fun. Don't make your landscape your master. Be always looking and evaluating if the plant is being productive. And it's 7:30, isn't it? 7:35. So I've got some more action steps. I can hit upon those next week or we can keep going. Won't take long. You know, so this is keep plants. The main thing is this bottom line. More plants are killed out of love than hate. Plants need to have the soil dry out before you water it again. We don't need to be having irrigations popping up in our lawns right now. It has plenty of water. I've seen that before. And when we are planting plants, we need to make sure that they have moisture, but we never want to have it saturated around the plant. And when we do water, we want to water deep because we want our roots to grow deep. So we want to get the water down deep in our soil, then let it dry out. You know, it's better to water to where the water soaks down a foot into your soil than just doing multiple waterings because roots grow where roots get what they need. So if they're not getting water down deep, the roots are going to percolate more at the soil surface during August. So when we water in August, we should water so the water goes deep. And that's, and then let it dry out, you know, before we water again. So that's just and we don't want our plants need moisture going into winter or they'll dry out from the winds. So we need to make sure they have moisture going in. So some plants need to be protected. Some roses, the graft union, we want to mount up. I've seen roses that go through severe winters and they don't regrow. That's because that area got damaged. So if plants are marginal and need to be protected, we want to make sure we protect those. And strawberries, most winters need to have that mulch to protect them to get through the winter. We've had 2 mild winters, so I think we're due. We can't have a mild winter every year. We live too far now.
Is that your warning, Bob?
That's my warning. Count on -20 this winter at some time. We're gonna get it. It's gotta happen sometime. We can't have mild winters every winter. So we need to protect the plants that need protection going into the winter. And if you have marginal plants, you want to just give them some minor protection, whether it's through that soil. But the key point when we're ever giving them protection, as soon as they break dormancy in the spring, we need to remove that soil so they can start growing normal again. And we don't want to cover them and protect them until they need it. So they are dormant. That's the key points to remember when we're giving additional protection to plants. I don't know why, but I bought these grapes that only can grow in Tennessee. At first I bought one because Walmart sold it. I thought this was ridiculous because it's not a zone 5 plant. It's a zone 6 to zone 7 plant. But if I were to actually let those grapes grow up, I'm going to have to put it on a trellis where I could bend it down and protect them in the wintertime and then put it up again. So it's going to be iffy if I even play around with them, but I got them now. I'll protect them this winter. They haven't grown that much this year. But if I would let them grow up normally, they're dead. They're going to have to be protected. I really didn't buy them to grow them, but now I got them and we took on that challenge. Leaves, we need to not have them mat up if we have a lot of leaves in our yard. Ideally, we mulch them or use them for compost because we should put the nutrients back into our soil. If you give them to the city, that's fine. They can compost for them. Hopefully they will do that so we can get it back as compost. But if we have a good mulching mower and it's not that many leaves, it's good just to leave them out there to recycle those nutrients back to our plants. That's why in this part of the country, we have shallow topsoil. This goes the leaves, trees dump all their organic matter every fall as leaves, and that's where it breaks down. So that's why historically our soil that has the best soil quality is the upper soil, because that all is happening. On the prairies, the roots grow in the soil and die back 70% of them every year. So that's why they have really deep organic soils, is because of how those plants die back every winter. So our trees, the roots don't die, they just drop their leaves. Grasses, 70% their roots die every year, including your lawn turf grass. That's why how well you take care of your turf this year is how good of a turf you're gonna have next year. So if you abuse your turf and don't take care of it, you're gonna see it next year. And we're having that issue, the fall wetworm feeding on grasses and hayfields this year because they're active again and feeding again. So whatever if they devour something now, that area is not going to be good next spring because the plant will be too stressed out.
So webworms that invite in,
I mean, fall armyworms. I'm sorry,
oh, okay,
I said wetworms.
they'll eat up the roots off the grass.
No, they'll just eat off the top.
Oh,
They'll leave the roots around, but they're stressing the plant out because it's trying to regrow it when it gets severely defoliated. Because in the turf areas, it turns brown from their feeding. Same way in the pasture fields, so they just eat off, so they encourage regrowth. And regrowth now, because we're too close to dormancy, it's not going to replenish all of its stored carbohydrates, so it's going to get stressed out. It won't die, but it's not going to be as active next spring because of it. And I see that at pasture fields all the time because people don't get their animals off the pasture fields in drought times. They just let them consume them to the ground. So then let me show you that one. That's about composting. That's not complicated, but it's a good thing to do. And what's neat about composting, you get bins that you top feed and just harvest from the bottom. They make them now, so it's not even a hard process. But if I mow close to the ground, my rooting depth is very shallow. If I'm mowing 3.5 inches, I have 8 to 10 inches of roots below the plant. So that plant's not going to go dormant as quick because it's going to stay tapped into moisture. So how we manage our turf determines how healthy of a root system, and that will determine how productive it is. That's why fertilizing in the fall is important, is because you're building that. And if you're mowing at the right height and you fertilize right, you're going to have a more vigorous turf plant that's going to be productive in your landscape and control weeds. If you have weeds coming up, you're mowing in the drought of the summer because they have a taproot and they're still growing while your grass isn't.
does it hurt though to move shorter in the fall?
I mean, like no, you should mow it at 3.5 inches and remove no more than 1/3 of the plant until it goes dormant. That's our recommendation.
And I think that's what I had heard also when your last mowing or two, get it short to prevent, I thought it was fungus over the winter.
Well, if you know when that's going to be, your last mowing wouldn't hurt a thing. that's when you do it.
No,
But you still don't want to go down to an inch because you're damaging
Yeah,
regrowth
no.
structures.
Sure.
I've never moved my fast.
You know, because just think, if I'm mowing at 3.5 inches, some of it I'm mowing at 3 inches because the ground's not that level. You know, that's just a given. You know, so that's how you keep it from going below 3 inches. But you don't want to do the base of your plant because that's how it regrows in the spring. But yeah, if you want to mow the last mowing a little shorter, you can do that. But just don't get carried away with it. Don't want to damage my regrowth structures. But people that are overgrazing, they just destroy it for the next year. It's not way better to feed hay this year and have good forage next year. Return the clippings to, because that's your fertilizer, right? There's no reason not to. The thatch is from over fertilization and overwatering. The thatch is stem tissue that builds up, right? It has nothing to do with the leaves. It's that you're overgrowing turf and it's not breaking down fast enough. So eventually it starts rooting in that thatch layer. And then that's when, even if you're mowing at 3.5 inches, that much of the roots are in the thatch that's accumulated, and that's why it gets droughty. Prevent rodent damage, question mark with deer damage, and frost protection from sun scalding, and you know, because like cherry trees are always prone to it. So if you have one that's going to directly expose the southern light, because I see people that have those ornamental ones where they put them so the wood actually grows down, so that union's way up. So you want to protect that stem tissue. The last thing you want the top to die and then start rooting off the trunk tissue, then they'll just be a regular cherry tree. So we want to think of where we plant them and then protect the trunk tissues for the winter. If it's particularly going to get full exposure from the south, that's what we worry about, the south. So if it's on the north side of your house, it's not as much of an issue as if it's being exposed on the south side. So we want to protect that bark so it doesn't crack. In this case, it's feeding on the trunk. We don't want to give the rodent a nice home called mulch right by the trunk, because they'll burrow in there and be feeding on it in that nice warm area. Because rodents need to gnaw on something always, right? They die if they don't. So they know they need to. Prevent deer damage. That's planting plants that they don't like. That is making something taste bad in the landscape that you really want to keep. So like your hostas, if you would just spray those and nothing else, they won't eat the hostas with a hot sauce. But if you,
You tried that?
you try that, I had a hosta grower Culver area that it worked for him with his recipe.
Beans and onion sauce.
There you go. Or maybe they got the deer, you got the deer that built up an immunity to the.
I think they'll eat anything, but
Oh, they will. I mean, if you treat everything, they won't work for sure. Because I eat the cold peas when I have to. So they're hungry, they'll eat it, you know. And I've seen them reach their heads through shrubs and eat beyond where it was treated too. I mean, they're really hungry. So these mild winters, has it been as bad? You're getting the feeding in the summer, right?
well, we had some. I don't. I don't know, but they would just devour those every.
Well, you can't legally sell barberries anymore because not only because the deer didn't like them, they thrived in our woodlands. And they produce a little berry that birds will eat and take and plant in the woods. That was the perfect solution in my opinion, because you could plant those in front of your windows and who's going to scratch themselves up trying to get in?
That's the one that we have that's still
Oh, right.
there. That looks like a purplish color.
Yeah.
Purple bush, yeah.
The thorns on it.
We have
so-
one of those. That's
Well, I'm sorry.
everything else we just was pulled out because they would just devour it. So it was terrible all the time.
My folks planted holly and the deer loved holly too.
Yep.
That,
Seems like they don't like boxwood.
they don't eat it, you know they don't like it. They eat poison ivy, that's a good thing about it. There's a product that a master gardener used on his daylilies and it worked, so I'll try and get that. I think I got the empty container back in my office.
Yeah, it has stuff that smells terrible and, smells like rotten eggs or whatever.
So the good thing about November, we can start planting our dormant lawns, so if you didn't plant them in late summer, this is when you can seed throughout the winter, so it's ready to go in the spring when it's dry. We can start pruning our ornamental woody plants, perennial woody plants and fruit trees. And it's a good time we can treat for scale insect with dormant oil. So any woody plant that you have that tends to have issues with that, you can use those in the wintertime to control them. And scale insects almost look like they're part of the tree. You just gotta know what they are. So when you look at your woody ornamentals, if you see a bump on there, you don't know what it is, go research it. So it could be a scale insect. They're hard body and they live on the tree and they suck nutrients out of it. That's it for tonight. Next week, bring me your questions and I've got some videos I did showing how to clean up a bad bed, prune that one shrub, and how I excavated a girdling root for the fun of it and some things I've done. And I'm going to talk about rain gardens because if you have drainage issues, creating a rain garden can help with that. Where you're scheduled to have more rain than normal, or annual rainfalls going up. So if you have drainage issues, having an area where it can drain to is a great thing to maybe help out. But this is also the time of year now, you can start checking that out. Because you have areas in your landscape that are wet in the wintertime, those are good areas that need to be managed because no plant likes it wet. So perennial plants need to have good drainage in the wintertime too. So if you have an area that tends not to be productive because it's too wet, that's a good place for a rain garden. And we'll talk about those next week.